Hello, everyone. Welcome to the panel. Today we have great speakers. We're going to talk about basically the complexities of the modular blockchain solutions. As you guys know, I'm a managing director at IOSG. I'll be moderating the panel. Maybe we take a quick turn of.
Statement. Okay. Foundation is sister, and so are we kind of seeing us. We launched the token. We've done all the air. We do all the granting, and then over time we'll be decentralized so that Eigen layer, like good decentralized protocols, becomes decentralized in governance as well. A couple of years off.
Hey guys, my name's Hart Lambur. I'm the co-founder of Across Protocol. We're bridging, if you want to call it that, but we're intent-based interoperability, commonly used for bridging assets between blockchains. And I think where I'm on this panel is when we talk about the L2 roadmap. It's been great in terms of bringing Ethereum scale, although maybe Max has critiques around that. But I think it's introduced a ton of other problems from a usability perspective, mainly. And so we've modularized all these chains. And one of the complexities is it's now really hard to use in a unified way. And so maybe we can talk about that some.
Perfect. Yeah. Thanks a lot for the introductions. And I think maybe the first question is going to be around maybe the biggest, what's something that we didn't have the last cycle is this cycle we have some of the monolithic chains in the space like Solana that are getting a lot of users, that are getting a lot of developer mindshare, that are getting a lot of liquidity. I think given that there's some sort of scalability that is being achieved over there, maybe if you could elaborate on what makes you think that the modular systems will have advantage over these monolithic chains in the current design. If you could give a couple of opinions on that, that would be a great start, and we can start from there.
Okay, I'll put a straw man out and let these guys rip it apart, right? But so 4 years ago, Ethereum was 15 transactions per second. And I mean, during DeFi summer, it cost like $50 to do the most basic thing. So it was expensive and didn't scale. We actually have solved that problem on the roll-up centric roadmap. You can now, it's only this year with blobs and 4844 this year. We now have any individual roll-up is fast and cheap, which is amazing. So any individual roll-up has a Solana-like experience now. And I'd argue we are massively more scalable. Curious Max's take on this. We are massively more scalable because if you want more scale, you just add another roll-up, right? There's nuances around like do blobs stay cheap and all that kind of stuff. But generally speaking, I think the general architecture works for massive scale, which is great. Modularity wins there, except we now have usability problems. That's my starting point.
Max or Robert, yeah.
Yeah, I guess my response to that would be to say like, oh, we have a similar experience on an L2, which is on a centralized box, as our competitor, which is actually an L1 that is distributed, is not a great dunk. It's like more of like a sad reality. I also think we have some issues in terms of scaling. There are fundamental bottlenecks. You mentioned one of them, which is DA, but like in general, all of this stuff just has to use up bandwidth. And that's kind of what's bottlenecking Solana in a lot of ways right now is the transaction ingestion pipeline and gossip and all these things. And I think it's like fundamentally a similar bottleneck. If the bottleneck was something more on the state side, on execution and making sure we have enough memory available to store the state that we're accessing, making sure there's enough bandwidth between storage and the CPU cache, like these things are not the problem right now on ETH, and they're not the problem right now on Solana. And so I think it's not like, I wouldn't agree with the point that we can currently scale faster than Solana or have more room to run because of the L2 roadmap.
Yeah, I mean, I generally agree with Max there. I think the technical side of scaling is actually coming together pretty well for Ethereum. There's a long period of kind of divergence, but now through protocols like Across, we're going to have a lot more tie-in of value in others. I think, you know, it's tough though that they're like in some sense, just even from like a business and community side, You have a number of different rollups, and they're kind of competing for similar protocols, similar users. I think, again, with things like across, maybe the liquidity fragmentation will get a lot better, but classically that's been a challenge for them as well. And really, attention is like the network effect, of Web3, attention and sentiment. And, having, I don't think there's been necessarily enough focus on that in the Ethereum community. I mean, one of the ways that I've heard it put that I think is kind of appropriate is that it's felt a lot like L2 execution across different rollups. They've been kind of zero sum, like they're growing, but they're also going after very similar groups while they're growing. And I don't know what the magic mechanism is, but what we really would want is positive sum. And it's definitely easier if you're starting off from a high performance chain like Solana, and then adding in protocol hierarchy now, which is kind of happening with network extensions. So it didn't have to be that way in the Ethereum space. There was definitely early on choices made about not canonizing key parts of rollups, like the base sequencer stuff. That's not a totally new idea. Like right when rollups were coming up, that was all thought of. And having kind of like default fraud-proof mechanisms that are also kind of canonized and stuff. And, once you have kind of merge sequencers, then, the kind of execution environment model around rollups would have been, I think, a lot more tied together. But, the desire, I think, a lot in the community has been definitely to push harder on decentralization and then try to figure out a way to kind of come back to the network effects. I think it's still possible. I think there's a lot of things that are kind of moving in the right direction, but Max is not wrong that it's been an impediment, and it's not solved currently either.
Yeah, maybe we could just briefly, I think we got like straight into the weeds, but just the modular idea of modularity was that you could have separate teams hyper-focused on providing one individual part of what's needed to build a blockchain. And then each of those people could specialize, build the best possible solution, and then if you put it all together, you have something that looks better than a team that's trying to, like Eunice, who was just up here, build the whole high-performance stack. That was the idea, I guess. And then I think the growing pains, which we're going to talk about, are... First of all, there's a question of where do the economics accrue if there's a bunch of teams working on different parts of the stack. Which of those are valuable? There's kind of a infighting that can happen there. And then the second thing is interoperability. If you have people building on the same base layer, how do you make sure that they build things that play nicely with each other when in a lot of cases the incentives are not to do that, for especially the front runners like a base, like a Arbitrum, for example. There's no reason for them to open up their interoperability and reduce their moat, because economically it makes sense to lock in their users. So those are the two growing pains, and we have several people who are, working on various parts of those on stage.
Yeah, I just say okay, so the modular stuff is messy, might be the way to summarize what you guys are saying. So you're supposed to have different teams specialize at these different layers, right? But then at each layer you have competition. So like DA layer, we've got like Eigen DA, Celestia. You've got blobs, which are kind of like the canonical version, I'll call it. But it gets messy. And then on the roll-up architectures, right? We have a very PvP roll-up ecosystems. Arbitrum and Optimism and ZK Sync, they're really at war. So you have a lot of innovation, but a lot of, you could argue, misaligned incentives. It looks like a very messy kind of capitalist structure that then creates all of this like points of friction because people are trying to capture value for themselves. But also a huge race to innovate too, I think, is the pro. So now let's talk about how we fix it.
Right.
Well, maybe one thing I can add there is I do want to make a distinction. If someone's listening to this, that they might take away that modular is the same as like L2 hierarchy. I do want to just make a distinction that there is definitely a broad swath of, if you look at the L2 rollups, that, I think before the modular thesis came out, which applies across L1s and L2s. It's just about specialization. L2s in the original thesis, and I'd still feel like a really big part of them is just about scaling execution capacity and lowering cost and increasing the amount of storage capacity in the chain. So it's not as ambitious as the modular breaking apart.
Maybe one thing I want to get your opinion on is if the modular thesis plays out in the future, right? I think there are different visions of what the L1 is going to be for. And I think this is where Max comes in and says, hey, let's bring all the DeFi or like the high value DeFi back to L1. And this is where we're going to have these like applications over there. Some other visions of it is let's keep it on the DA level and then let's just provide the availability for the L2s that are building on top. I'd love to listen to like, what is your vision? Where do you think we should take the L1 to?
So I just, again, like my last comment there, right. There's modularity and there's hierarchy, and they're not necessarily the same things. So modular, I think, is, very helpful because the idea that the L1 chains, especially if they have so much shit that they need to get accomplished, they're not going to innovate every single part of their stack together. And you look at like for Ethereum, which I know the best, you look at the Vitalik endgame roadmap or really flowchart or diagram with a lot of arrows. If everybody was able to work on all parts of that, it could happen a lot faster. If they had, a kind of very I don't want to speak too much for it because I have friends that are in various parts of like core dev and developing it, and it is really hard to pull something like that together as decentralized as they're doing it. But there's a real advantage with modularism there that you break a big problem into pieces that can innovate. I also think that competition is one of the best drivers of efficiency and innovation. I mean, it's, I think, in a lot of sense, the reason why essentially every social organization for societies and governments have kind of moved to wrapping themselves around capitalism at the economic layer. They just use it in different ways. And that's because capitalism emphasizes the idea that, with a oligopoly or monopoly, or I don't remember what the monopsony or whatever those different words are, you just get very inefficient pricing. You also get very slow feature improvement over just extracting from a network and not innovating. So, so modularism, I think, helps, with that as well, because it enables new people in the space. I mean, look at how many privacy protocols, look at how many sequencing protocols we have, and, DA and Eigenlayer for a long time. We did a tremendous amount of work in kind of like Airbnb, like unlocking the relatively fixed trapped security that was inside of L1s or inside of ERC20s, and just created like a very fluid marketplace for renting and utilizing those. So, and now, once we came out and we proved the thesis, and people started betting real money on it, then all of a sudden a bunch of fast followers started popping up, which is great because the competition and the feature velocity in the space, I can say for sure, for us, I mean, it's a great opportunity. I think Eigenlayer is going to, have a much better chance to succeed with a lot of competition.
I would just push back a little bit on, I think it's nice to see that we have a bunch of innovation going on the L2s. I would say there might be an issue that we have a bunch of pieces being put together and not necessarily taken together as a whole. So for example, like you have Arbitrum coming out with Stylus, but then having a completely awful sequencer design with time boost. And then you have Optimism, who doesn't seem to be doing anything on their VM, but is working very hard on priority ordering and exposing the priority fee, which I think is a much better design than what Arbitrum's doing. And like if you put those two together, it looks really nice. But because each team focuses their resources on one individual part of the stack, you don't get the compounding effects, the multiplier of everything being optimized all at once. And that's the worry I see in this system developing today, is that everybody has their pet issues, And in an L1 on Solana, for example, there's somebody who has a pet issue about transaction ingestion and they're working on STL. And there's somebody whose pet issue is the scheduler. And there's somebody whose pet issue is sig verify, making that fast and parallelized. And there's somebody whose pet issue is working on Geo. Like everybody has their pet issues and they're all kind of in parallel optimizing those things. And it ends up with something that's greater than the sum of its parts. Whereas if everybody's kind of working on their one thing, you might end up with everybody kind of being around equal, but much below the thing you could have if everybody was cooperating.
Maybe say, like Max, I agree with that. The other problem is innovating at like the base layer too. So all this innovation is supposed to plug into Ethereum. We're at DevCon, so we'll talk about Ethereum. It's all supposed to plug into Ethereum, but like you can't exactly build it to plug in other things at the same time. It's not like we can have the core devs at Ethereum in comp with some other like alt Ethereum core devs. And that I think is where I see the competition. The competition exists at a more meta layer at like ETH versus Solana, let's say. But it would be really nice if it could be much more hyper focused like it is in kind of other layers of this stack.
Max, do you want to talk a little bit more about like I think you're pushing like we have to scale L1 as well, Ethereum L1, and like moving in that direction. What would the timeline of the research look like for that? Like, and what are some of the immediate steps that we are planning to take to scale the L1? If you could talk a bit more about that, that would be great.
Yeah, I think so. There's a short-term version of scaling and improving the L1, which is we need to get to faster block time and more gas per block. So that's just kind of a short-term thing we can do. We know we can do it. We could go to 60 million gas per block today. We could go to 6 or 8 second blocks today. There are EIPs for those things. I'm optimistic that they'll be not in the next hard fork because that's already well scoped, but in the hard fork after that, because there's a lot of appetite among core devs, especially after the conversations that have happened over the past 3 or 4 months to make those changes. And even the core devs who, unlike me, think that the L2 roadmap is going really well, think that those changes are necessary for improving the L2 roadmap as well. Like even if you think all of the execution is going to happen on L2s, they still need to update their state routes on the L1s, so there's state diffs that have to happen there. That costs compute, and so there's still some bottlenecking at the L1 performance that has to happen, and then interoperability, of course, and finality come with those slot times. So that's the short term, is those two things, which I think we can do today. We haven't done them in a while. Moore's law has happened. So we have some technological improvements that we just need to like actually crank the dial up on those. In the longer term, there is a push for single slot finality, which I think will be really helpful for roll-up interoperability. And there's a push for multi-proposer of some sort, which would make the L1 a much more friendly place for DeFi. One of the problems with these centralized sequencers on L2s is, hey, they're super fast. Right now, they may claim not to be extractive, but once you start to put a bunch of flow through a centralized sequencer that's controlled maybe by Coinbase, for example, a for-profit company in the US who's literally, if they do not maximize profit for their shareholders, it is criminal negligence. It is prosecutable by law in the United States if you do not extract the maximum rent. And so if we give them a bunch of rent to extract, they're going to do it because it's like illegal not to. So we cannot let them do that. And one of the ways to do that is just not let anybody have that pot of rent and just destroy it. And that's what multi-proposer can do. And once you say, hey, nobody can take this pot of rent out, you actually make a much, much larger pie and everybody can slice their tiny little sliver off and be very happy.
And I think one question is, and it's never like one or the other, but Ethereum has the capacity and is already working on multiple of these questions, but how do you see L1 scaling in relation to L2 adoption? Because there's a liquidity, like network effect to liquidity itself, right? And L2s are already scaling to an extent where they will be having a lot of liquidity and users on their platforms and developers too. So depending on the timeline, it might be actually a bit too late for L1 to actually get back all these users and applications and developers back to there. and all that execution might be happening on an L2s. So in terms of this timeline and interaction between L1 and L2s, also curious like what you guys think overall. Is there a race or?
Yeah, I mean, I think people have been. Did you want to go first? No. Okay.
No. I mean, I got thoughts, but go
Yeah.
over it.
Okay. Sorry. I saw your microphone in the air, in the corner, out of the corner of my eye. I think kind of self-induced in the community, Ethereum got really focused on looking at the sound economics and then going to ultrasound economics with the burn and this kind of thing, which is, always sort of an interesting choice. Startups in Web 2 would go pretty long periods of time before they worried about the revenue phase about things. And, you don't kind of hear anybody in the Bitcoin space worried about either inflation. I mean, maybe there are some people, but about inflation and about how much revenue the chain is accumulating, because there is no revenue. It all gets passed on. It always will be. So it's a little bit of a self-imposed story. I mean, I think, it's important, in my opinion, like alpha is just knowing what the next story is going to be in a lot of cases. Even things like PE ratios and stuff, I mean, that was a story, right? Now we're in investing market, even in the stock market, which is a lot more about narratives than the financials and the beliefs. So you can get to these 5,000, PE ratios or even infinite, right? Negative earnings and, very high stock growth. So I think there's a bigger question in my mind, which is like, if the story about Ethereum remains on getting to better and better ultrasound economics, it's pretty challenging because, if L1 doesn't take back value from L2, which hurts L2 growth by either slowing down block growth or, by doing base sequencing or things like that, then the current story that they're going with is going to be one that doesn't look super positive. We saw a period of time there. I mean, I was shocked at one point. I mean, it's like, whoa, gas is less than 1 gwei. I'm seeing a fraction of a gwei. I'm like, wow, that's insane. It's back up to like more sane numbers. But so, I mean, I kind of pose the question of like, why is that the story of Ethereum right now? Like Ethereum is like a store of objective security. It's a very common kind of like the US dollar, a pretty canonical reference currency across DeFi. And, maybe some people feel like they won't move back to that mode, but, that has a value on its own. I mean, that's the entire value of something like Bitcoin. And so, I don't know, there's different stories where that makes more sense.
I would say this, like the PE multiple story is not necessarily just a story. It's like backed up by a no arbitrage condition. If the multiple is like 8x on revenue, for example, that comes from the fact that you could take out a loan at the prevailing interest rate, buy the asset, and then pay off your loan and make a profit. That's like the place where that multiple came from. It is not like just, oh, that's what it's worth. Like the idea was that there was a no arbitrage condition there. That's why the multiple depends on what the interest rate is, because the no arbitrage depends on how much the interest on your loan was. I think the reason that people like that story is because it gives you peace of mind, because you know that this is not based on vaporware and vibes. It's based on real revenue. And if somebody tries to take the price below what the thing is worth, there's an arbitrage available for intelligent financial actors to bring it back. So it's a peace of mind and sleeping soundly at night, where we know that we built something useful. We can see it in the revenue that's coming in. And I think a lot of the core dev community, just like, we want to build something useful with ETH. Whether we think it's the L2 roadmap, that's the way to do that or not, I think we all are in agreement that ETH should be useful. And like, that is the scoreboard. It's like, people are willing to pay for something because you've given them a useful service.
Yeah, I mean, I would just like, all of that is absolutely true. When I put on my math and intellectual brain, when I turn on that part, all of it is true. But there's another view, which is like everything you just described is a story that math is the basis and that economics are the basis. And, I mean, like you can look at PE ratios moving from 20 to 200 based on growth and projections and other things, and that tells you there are other stories that are going on. And increasingly now we're getting to memification of everything, and so it's detaching a little bit more from that. So I definitely agree. It's like a shelling point. The logical shelling point is a good baseline there. I guess I would just say that, especially in crypto, when you look at things like Bitcoin and Ethereum, it's a bit of a stretch from the stock market case. You don't have Ethereum going out and minting more tokens, taking loans out against it, doing corporate development. So so anyway, we could, debate that for a little while, but I just kind of go back to this point of like just recognizing that, a story is a shared belief among people, and that's like the most powerful indication of what they want to participate in, in various ways, including ownership.
Yeah, I mean, okay, I'll take this in a different direction because we're going back to like the L1 versus L2 thing. There's another reason why people want L2s, and it's not just scaling. It's because people like having their own blockchain because they think they can capture value or vibes, right?
Yeah, 100%. My token, my
token, right? And like, by the way, I don't think we've exactly figured out how launching your own L2 is going to give you a token yet, like custom gas token maybe, but I don't know. Like, there's stuff there to figure out. But generally speaking, there is, I think, an intuitive sense that if I have my own chain, I'm worth more than not. Like, I'll leave it that broadly. And so there's an incentive out there, a very real one, that I don't think is wrong, by the way. I think you can justify this in all sorts of ways. But there's an incentive out there that I want to have my own chain because I'm going to make more money that way. And so the L2 roadmap is maybe kind of brilliant in that it's becoming a credible way for people to have their own chain, but it is at least theoretically tied to Ethereum. Yeah. So Ethereum becomes a launch point for quote unquote your own roll up, your own chain. And again, if we figure that out, if we figure out the interoperability and we can use all these chains very seamlessly and easily, and we do figure out a lot of Max's points about like, okay, wait, does that actually bring value back to the L1? I don't know. That seems like a pretty good, happy place. There are just, again, what's the title? There are some complexities in this modular system to figuring that out.
Perfect, yeah.
Yeah, by the way, I blame Chris Dixon for this on the token side, because early on, he just sort of was like, crypto is tokens. I'm only going to invest in tokens.
That's not just Chris Dixon. I mean, he said that, but yes, we've all...
No, it's fine. We can blame him.
IOSG makes money off of tokens.
No, I mean, everyone does. It's just, he was very outspoken. I'm just,
Agreed.
I like to personify it if I can.
Yeah, thanks a lot.
Read, write, own his book.
I think we didn't even have chance to go like even 1/3 of the questions, but I wish we had more time. But thanks a lot for the insights, and I suggest the audience to maybe ask more questions if you have after we get off. Thanks a lot for joining. Yeah.
Thank you guys for having us. Thank you.